Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The Arab League has endorsed calls to revive indirect talks between Israeli and Palestinian negotiators. The talks have been suspended amidst Palestinian opposition to ongoing Israeli settlement construction and home demolitions in the occupied West Bank. On Wednesday, Palestinian negotiator Saeb Erekat urged the Obama administration to become more involved in peace talks.
Have no illusion that upon the Israeli practices, Arabs saw it very, very clear that this Israeli government is undermining the efforts. But nevertheless, a chance was given. We hope that the American administration will seize this opportunity in the forthcoming months in order to introduce its bridging proposals of the two states on the 1967 borders.
President Obama has officially endorsed calls for approving health care reform legislation through the legislative process known as budget reconciliation. This would enable Senate Democrats to pass a health care bill with 51 votes, rather than the 60-vote supermajority needed to overcome a Republican filibuster. On Wednesday, Obama rejected Republican calls for starting over on health care reform.
But given these honest and substantial differences between the parties, about the need to regulate the insurance industry and the need to help millions of middle-class families get insurance, I don't see how another year of negotiations would help. Moreover, the insurance companies aren't starting over. They're continuing to raise premiums and deny coverage as we speak. For us to start over now could simply lead to delay that could last for another decade or even more.
Obama's announcement sets the stage for a vote in the coming weeks. Although they won't be able to filibuster, Republicans are expected to mount a major challenge to the bill by offering scores of amendments and challenging provisions over their effect on the federal budget. In Iraq, at least 9 people have been killed in separate suicide bombing attacks earlier today. 7 were killed when a bomber struck a crowded Baghdad market. The attacks come as Iraqis have begun early voting ahead of Sunday's parliamentary elections. Violence has increased in the lead-up to the vote, prompting Obama administration officials to float the idea of delaying the planned September deadline for withdrawing combat troops. On Wednesday, Vice President Joe Biden said the U.S. would continue military operations after the deadline. In an interview with the New York Times, Biden said the majority of remaining troops, quote, will still be the guys who can shoot straight and go get bad guys. We're not leaving behind cooks and quartermasters, he said. In other Iraq news, BBC News is reporting the town of Fallujah is experiencing an unusually high number of birth defects among its newborn children. One hospital doctor reported seeing 2 or 3 cases of birth defects each day, which would translate to over 1,000 per year. Doctors and parents are said to widely blame U.S. weaponry used during the 2 major attacks on Fallujah in 2004. The assaults killed hundreds of Fallujah residents and displaced thousands more. In Iran, government forces appear to be intensifying a crackdown on opposition members. On Wednesday, at least 6 human rights advocates were reportedly arrested. Human rights groups have voiced concern over the fate of a 20-year-old university student they believe has been sentenced to death on charges of throwing rocks at a rally in December. The student, Mohammed Amin Valian, is said to face imminent execution. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, the Obama administration has begun circulating a new round of proposed sanctions against Iran. On Wednesday, the Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva rejected new sanctions on Iran ahead of a meeting with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, saying, quote, the prudent thing is to establish negotiations. Clinton was in Brazil as part of her first visit to Latin America as Secretary of State. It also comes a week after Latin American and Caribbean nations agreed to form a new regional body excluding the United States and Canada as an alternative to the Organization of American States. At a news conference, Clinton criticized the Venezuelan government.
We are deeply concerned about the behavior of the Venezuelan government, which we think is unproductive with respect to its relations with certain neighbors, which we believe is limiting slowly but surely the freedoms within Venezuela, therefore adversely impacting the Venezuelan people. And we would hope that there could be a new start on the part of the Venezuelan leadership to restore full democracy, to restore freedom of the press, to restore private property and return to a free market economy. We wish Venezuela were looking more to its south and looking at Brazil and looking at Chile.
In Honduras, Human Rights Watch is warning of ongoing attacks against opponents of the coup that overthrew then-President Manuel Zelaya last year. On Wednesday, Human Rights Watch said at least 3 people have been killed and another 8 jailed in what appears to be politically motivated attacks over the past month. The majority of victims were members of the National Popular Resistance Front, which opposed the coup and boycotted the vote that elected Honduran President Porfirio Lobo. The Washington Post is reporting the Obama administration is considering lifting a 12-year-old ban on training an elite Indonesian military unit linked to scores of abuses. Under the proposal, the U.S. military would test a training program for younger members of the Kopassus. 4 top members of Kopassus are currently in Washington to discuss the plan. The proposal comes ahead of President Obama's scheduled visit to Indonesia later this month. On Capitol Hill, Democratic Congressmember Charlie Rangel of New York has announced he's taking a leave of absence from his post as chair of the House Ways and Means Committee. The move comes days after the House Ethics Committee faulted Rangel for accepting corporate-sponsored trips to the Caribbean. On Wednesday, Rangel said he was temporarily stepping aside to avoid becoming a liability amidst the health care reform push and ahead of the November midterm elections.
In order to avoid my colleagues having to defend me during their elections, I have this morning sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi asking her to grant me a leave of absence until such time as the Ethics Committee completes its work.
California Congressmember Pete Stark will become the interim head of the House Ways and Means Committee. And the top general in charge of training the U.S. Army is warning the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are hampering efforts to train American troops. In a memo last month, General Martin Dempsey, the commander of the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, said the Army's training ability is, quote, increasingly at risk. Dempsey says the wars have forced the military to rely on outside contractors to train troops, with just 30% of instructors now coming from the Army's own ranks. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
And welcome to all of our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.